So now that we've talked about the different types of estates, the different relationships, that's all an estate is. And Sheree, I think your hand's still up from earlier. If you got a question, let me know. I think you're good. We've talked about the different types of ownership estates. We've talked about the different types of lease estates. Now what we want to do is talk about how those relationships change if we have more than one owner. Because up to this point, the way we focused on ownership has been to completely pretend that real estate is owned singularly.
Right.
Which is, you have to do that in the beginning. You have to start from the basics and then kind of layer things on.
And I think it's really important to emphasize what Travis just said, like we are putting a very thick brick wall between what we just learned, and not necessarily from the sense that they don't relate to each other. It's just what we talked about before is what is your relationship to the property when we're talking about freehold, which is ownership, or non-freehold, which is non-ownership, but some kind of leasehold relationship to the property. With that brick wall that we're humping over right now, we're talking about, is there only one owner of this property who has a relationship, or is there more than one? And what are the benefits?
And that's exactly right. Because I think we can all agree that when you get multiple people involved in any situation, things become more complex. Now, I mean, obviously, so I want you to think of it this way. If land is owned by only one person, I'm going to skip ahead a slide and I'll come back and put a word with that. If land is owned by only one person, it's very easy to understand who gets to use the land. If land is owned by one person or one company, who gets to use that land?
One person, the owner.
The owner. And how much of the time does that owner get to use that land?
All.
100%.
All the time. Super easy to understand that, right?
Right.
That is called, by the way, ownership in severalty. And I know that word can be a little bit confusing. Here's the way I remember it. An owner in severalty has severed or cut all ties with everyone else. They own the land how?
And severalty is single.
By themselves.
Singular, by themselves. They have cut all ties to other owners. They are the solo owner of the property. And that really does simplify our life, especially as real estate brokers. I mean, think about it. If you're thinking about listing a property and it's owned in severalty, how many sellers do you have to convince to hire you to list the property?
One.
It's one.
Just one. How many sellers do you have to convince to accept an offer?
One.
Just one. If you were selling this house, though, the house that I own, do you have to convince just me, or do you have to convince me and Andrew to list this house?
You and
Andrew.
And Andrew. And who do you have to sell on an offer?
You and Andrew.
Me and Andrew. I mean, that's the whole premise of the stupid show we did, right? Love it or list it. It's like two people who, what the whole idea is, one wants to do one wants to do the other. And how do you manage that? It gets more complex when you have multiple owners. Ownership in severalty is very straightforward because it is solo ownership. How do we all feel about that statement before we move on and before we add complexity to this? Are we all good on what ownership in severalty means and why that is the simplest way to own real estate?
This would be the most simple.
Yeah. Now, this is not different than the type of ownership we talked about earlier. This is just how many people have that type of ownership. So like an owner, the absolute best type of ownership is an owner in severalty who got fee simple absolute ownership.
That's true.
Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Whereas like my grandfather had a life estate in severalty. He owned the property, but his type of ownership was a life estate. But how many owners own the life estate?
Two.
One.
Just one.
One.
That's ownership in severalty. So that was type of ownership. This is how many people are sharing that ownership. Are we all good with that idea, that differentiation that we're making there?
If not, let us know.
Yeah, because that's important to get your mind headed in the right direction here. And as we said, that does make it much more simple, much more straightforward, because there's no sharing involved. The one owner in severalty has 100% of the rights, 100% of the time, 100% use, 100% occupancy, 100% of the decision making. They get 100% of the money when the property sells. It just straight across the board, easy.
Hey, Travis, I
Yes.
just noticed that the single entity, like a corporation or an LLC, are we going to go into that any further?
Same thing.
Same thing?
You treat company just like a person in the sense of an LLC. If an LLC owns a property and one LLC owns the property, then it's ownership in severalty. That means that one LLC owns 100% of the interest and can use the property 100% of the time, etc.
I just got a private question. What we are covering now is types of ownership. Before the brick wall, those were types of estates, correct? And I had just replied and said, no, what you just said is the exact same thing. What we talked about before is the type of ownership / estate. Now we're just saying how many.
Yeah,
how many?
Exactly right. Before the break, type of estate, type of ownership, type of relationship. They all mean the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Type. Now we're talking about count. How many? Singular or plural, right? Singular ownership is called ownership in what?
Severalty.
There are, gotta love it, multiple categories of shared ownership. Shared ownership means how many owners do we now have? More than
one.
More than one.
It could be two. And I love the way Seth put that in the chat. Look at how he wrote that out. How many people have fee simple absolute estate in this property? How many people have a life estate in this property? How do they share that ownership? This is all about sharing. Sharing is caring, right?
Right.
Which is a lie, because I'm an only child and I don't believe in any of that mess. Just that's a no for me. I don't know what y'all. I don't know how you survived. Share. No. Here's the only problem.
Concurrent.
Here's the only problem with being an only child. When something's broke, there's no like guessing game about who did it. Like we gonna blame it on you, invisible friend. I didn't do it. Who did? I can hear my dad right now. Well, no, who did?
The dog.
So Travis.
Yes.
I was just gonna say, do you mind going back to the original slide of where we were introducing how many? Please.
Right here?
Okay, yes, please. I just want to make sure everybody's making this distinction, because when we get to number 2, the second box, it says concurrent ownership. There are several types of concurrent ownership. So remember, severalty is number 1. Concurrent is number 2, but we're going to break that down 3 times. So don't misconstrue that those 3 things that we're breaking down in number 2, concurrent ownership, are going to be like, number 3, common interest. That's a whole nother third category. So just remember, concurrent ownership, there are 3 types of that.
This help?
Yes. So just remember, when we say concurrent, we're talking about one big main idea that gets broken down into 3 different types.
Exactly what we're about to do. Seth likes that linear.
Oh, God, yes.
And I think it's helpful. This is now what we're moving into. We just talked about ownership and severalty. That's one owner. So now we want to talk about concurrent ownership. Concurrent literally just means shared. They mean the exact same thing. It means more than what number of owners?
One.
More than one at the same time. Now, we're not talking about historically. Of course, every property's got more than one owner historically. We're talking about right now, at this current moment, how many people have an ownership interest in this property? If it's more than one, that's called ownership in severalty. If it's more than one, that's called concurrent ownership. And concurrent ownership has 3 forms, and we're going to talk about the differences between these 3 forms. This is a major test topic. There is no doubt in my mind that you will see multiple test questions about these 3 different forms of shared ownership.
And they know people mix it up.
They do. And folks, the rights and the privileges that are going to be given to these owners are very different in these three different types of ownership. And so we have to know how to differentiate them. How people share ownership matters. What I mean, think about some of the natural questions that pop to mind. If we have more than one owner, which one of them can use the property at any given time? That's a question we need to answer. If we have more than one owner, are they equal? Like, or does one own more and one own less, or they have to be even, or how does that work? That's a question we have to answer when they're sharing ownership. Yes, messy. And look at this one. God, this is a big question we have to, and don't you try to answer it yet, because I promise you don't know the answer yet.
We're just reflecting right now.
We're just like, these are rhetorical questions right now. Does every owner have to agree on selling the property? How many of y'all think that's a big question that's got to be answered when you have more than one owner?
Yeah,
definitely. Yes.
Now, what if there's a disagreement between the owners and one wants to sell and the other doesn't, or there's 10 owners and 9 of them want to sell? And I mean, is this like a democracy and you vote them out?
You all have to agree.
How does
your interest?
See, you just did what I told you not to do. You tried to answer it. You're not prepared to answer this question. You don't know the answer to this question because it doesn't work the way you think it does. Right
there
now,
are so many aspects.
So many of you are sitting out there going, "Oh, I know. You got to have all the owners agree." That's a lie. It doesn't work that way. In some of these types of ownership, it works that way, but not in others. And we got to be able to differentiate which ones work which ways. This is coming on the test, folks, and this is so important in the real world. Raise your hand, quick show of hands. I have anybody in the class who owns a property, like your home, with somebody you're not married to. Do I have anybody in that situation who owns their house with somebody they're not married to? I'm just
Shay. Haley, somebody said I do.
Well, I guess technically we're talking about people who didn't say I do. If we're talking, no, I'm kidding.
That's what I was thinking.
You said Shay and who else? Haley. So
Lanesia.
And Lanesia. So Lanesia said she owns her home with someone that's not a legally married spouse. Now that might be significant other, it might be best friend, it might be, whatever it is, whoever it is. Lanesia, hold on to your chair now. Just hold on. Do you know that other person can sell their interest in that property without ever telling you, without ever asking you, without your permission, to anybody on planet Earth, and you now own the property with that new person, with no ability to say no, with no ability to stop it, with no ability to do anything about it. And that is the law in these here United States of America.
I did know that.
There you go.
That's scary.
Folks, the way these relationships work is super important. Shay said she owns the property with her daughter. Shay, your daughter can sell her share in that property without your permission.
Now, I do have a question for you,
Wouldn't it be like when Chandler moved out on Joey and Friends and he had that shitty ass roommate?
Probably.
If the person that I own the property with, when we deeded the property, it says that when they died has to come back to me so that I have full ownership in the property.
Well, that's a whole different thing. If that's what your deed says, that's what your deed says. But that's where that would be a very rare outlier circumstance. What we're talking about are standard ways in which, how many people do you think are out there that buy a house with somebody they're dating and think there's no way that their significant other could sell any portion or any share of that house without their permission? How many of y'all think that's the way people feel?
A lot.
Probably the whole majority.
Absolutely. That's what I'm sitting here thinking. I'm like, a lot of people who buy properties together probably think that you have to have everybody's permission before you sell.
Yeah. Haley said that was me until 30 seconds ago. There you go. You were this many years old when you learned that you can sell your interest in that property. I mean, and folks, that could get nasty. What if you break up with that person and you want to sell your half of the house to their most bitter enemy for $1. Could you do it?
Oh, I'm a budget
Yes.
up.
Uh-huh.
I'm
And they can't do a thing about it. Can't stop.
gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna get you. I got you.
And so, Jessica, that's a great question. Jessica said, if you're married, y'all both have to agree. Well, maybe. Depends on the type of ownership you got. Brian said, what determines what percent somebody gets? Depends on the type of ownership you got. It's all about the type of ownership, folks. It's all about the type. And that's why this next subject is so important. Because
And Cynthia, don't say they can do anything, because it depends.
Well, and that's the thing. The type of shared ownership they have is going to dictate what one owner can do with or without the other owner. That's why these are important. That's why the differences are important. Flo, did you have a question?
More of a comment, but a lot of these absurdities, in quote, but passionately, I mean that,
Right.
For real estate law, makes sense now that we're studying this, but my first introduction to absurdities in real estate was when I bought my home last summer. And they told me when I was at closing, they told me that even though I'm single and I'm the sole owner, if I'm married and by the time I'm getting ready to sell the house, my husband has to agree to it. And I was like, but I bought the house by myself.
We're going to talk. Yep.
Christina mentioned that, and I think that's a great example to come back to.
Yep.
When we get there.
We are going to talk about that. So let me activate this question here, and then we're gonna talk about it. Kara and Jake purchase a 20-acre piece of land together. Kara will have 80% of the ownership interest in the property, while Jake has the remaining 20% ownership interest. Which statement is not true? Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but I want to see where your brain is. Okay. Kara and Jake purchase a 20-acre piece of land together. Kara will have 80% of the ownership interest in the property, while Jake has the remaining 20% ownership interest. Which statement is not true? A, Jake is allowed to occupy the property at any time, even if this upsets Kara. B, this type of shared ownership is known as concurrent ownership. C, Kara will have use of 16 acres while Jake has use of 4 acres. Or D, ownership of real property is unlimited in the number of owners. Which one of these is not true?
Which is not true. Is this national, Travis?
National, yes.
Cool. I think most are thinking C is not the right answer, but is.
So remember our test taking strategy. Whenever we see a negative word, what are we going to do with each one of the answer choices? Label each one what?
True or false?
True or false, and choose the one that's different, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So let's look through these. A, Jake is allowed to occupy the property at any time, even if this upsets Kara. Folks, that is true. And here's why that is true. Jake is a what?
Owner.
Owner.
And if you have the word owner beside your name, you are allowed to access all of that property all the time, no matter what percentage of the ownership. So even though Kara put in way more of the money, are they both going to get the same use and enjoyment out of this property?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are. Okay. That is a true statement. B, this type of shared ownership is known as concurrent ownership. That is absolutely true, because anytime you have more than how many owners?
One.
That is called concurrent ownership. C, Kara will have use of 16 acres while Jake has use of 4 acres. That is a false statement. How many acres is Jake going to have use of?
All of it.
100.
All of it.
16.
20.
All of it. 20 acres.
20
Oh,
acres.
20.
Kara's going to have use of 20 acres. Jake's going to have use of 20 acres. They get the whole thing.
Yep.
Even if they don't like each other. And D, ownership of real property is unlimited in the number of owners. That is also a true answer. We could have 100 people own this property together if we wanted to, or 1,000. It doesn't matter. So we choose the one that's different. Kara will have use of a different portion than Jake. That is simply not true, folks.
Right. All the specifics of these answer choices are going to come up in the next coming slides, but I do think even if you didn't see those, you could use common sense to answer these.
Right.
So don't feel bad if you don't get it just yet.
So Josh asked, what does percentage of ownership means? It just means Kara put in more money than Jake did. Kara put in 80% of the money, so she has 80% of the ownership. Well, that's great for Kara, but not while they own the property. When is that only going to matter? There's 2 times when that percentage would matter for Kara.
When they sell it.
When they sell.
When they
sell the property.
would get more money than him, or when they lease.
Right.
The lease, the rent would be split proportional to this as well.
And that would also be located on the deed. Is that right?
Right. This percentage of ownership would have to be located on the deed. It would have to identify that they own differing shares.
Just for money purposes.
For monetary purposes. Exactly. Because otherwise, 20 years from now, when I get ready to sell, Jake's going to be like, no, we're 50-50. Yes. Karen's going to be like, honey, no, we ain't. Remember that deed right there? Mm-mm.
You might have leveled up those 20 years, but you weren't leveled up 20 years ago.
You're right. That's exactly right. Okay. So as we start to talk about these 3, and just a reminder, we're going to talk about these 3 different: tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenancy by the entirety. There's going to be one idea that's really going to make this whole thing sort of revolve for us. Okay. There's going to be one thing that makes this whole idea revolve: the idea of survivorship. Survivorship is one of the most important legal rights that co-owners can share with each other. Notice I said that co-owners can share with each other. I did not say that co-owners do share with each other. Folks, this is not automatic. It is not automatic that co-owners will share the right of survivorship. They are not guaranteed to share the right of survivorship. What is true is that the right of survivorship is a right that can be shared between co-owners if they choose to. So what does survivorship mean? Survivorship, now help me out here. Is survivorship automatic, or does it have to be chosen?
Chosen.
It has to be chosen.
It has to be chosen. It's not automatic. And that's going to be important for you all, because I guarantee you, some of you, Lenasia, Haley, assumed this is the way it was going to work. Here's what survivorship is. Survivorship is the legal idea that co-owners don't need to have a will for that property. That co-owners intend for the ownership to stay in their group if something happens to one or more of them. Survivorship is the legal idea that when you have multiple owners, if one of them dies, their share stays in the group. Their share simply gets absorbed by the group. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
So
Yes.
Travis, Seth, and Leslie buy a property. We asked for the right of survivorship. Seth does not die, but Travis does. His share gets absorbed by Leslie and Seth.
The 2 remaining that have the right of survivorship. That's exactly right. It is a right that when it is in effect, basically says the ownership is going to stay within this group of people without a will. And somebody asked this question: does it supersede a will? Yes. Survivorship, Jay, survivorship itself is not automatic. But when survivorship is present, the transfer is automatic. Survivorship is not automatically in place. But when survivorship is in place, then the transfer of ownership is automatic. When one of the owners dies, that ownership will be absorbed by the survivors.
Yes,
by the
yes.
people who are still alive.
Said secondly or alternatively, because I have a hard time coming up with words when I'm actually speaking, the process is automatic, but the right is not.
Correct. You have to choose this right. And where does this have to be identified? What document is the most important document in all of legal?
The deed.
The
The
deed.
deed. So
Deed.
when would this choice have to be made, folks? When do you receive the deed to your property?
When
When you
Buy.
buy
Take
or
ownership.
buy-
When you
buying a
purchase
house.
it. When you purchase the property. When you purchase that land, you have to make this choice right away because it has to be identified on the deed. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Travis, when I purchased my house, I purchased it with my grandmother because I was like 19 turning 20. So what we did was we did the rights of survivorship so that if anything happens to her or I, it goes to the opposite person.
It goes to the other
Oh, I
person.
love that.
That's exactly what you asked for when you specified on your deed that you wanted that right of survivorship. How many of y'all, and be honest, because I was this person when I took the class, how many of you all just assumed that's the way it worked anyway, that if 2 or more people bought property together and one of them died, then the other one was just going to take over the ownership?
Right. Me.
It's not the way it works. It's not the way it works. It's not the way it works. It only works that way if those people have asked for the right of survivorship.
So Travis, you have a couple. Well, so I buy a house somewhere down the road, I get married. Then I have to go and change that deed.
Well, we haven't talked yet about how marriage implicates that. But what I'm going to say to you is when you buy that property, if that deed doesn't indicate survivorship, then you don't have it, period. End of story.
So Travis, this can also be an example of being a beneficiary.
Well, I think that's just you trying to tie words together that don't go together. It's not a beneficiary. This is a co-owner. This is somebody you already own the property with. They already are your co-owner. This is not you're leaving your ownership to someone. This is somebody that you own the property with, and absolutely not a deed cannot be amended. What do we say about deeds? They are what?
Forever.
Forever. If
you better make sure it's right.
In your brain, you got to get that nailed down. There's no changing a deed. You might do another deed. You might transfer the property again, and then there's another chance because there's a new deed. But you're not changing that deed that's there.
Right. Using that example that you were given, Travis, before you started this entire section, you were asking who bought property with somebody who is not a spouse or married. This would be as if 2 people who are dating buy a property, they don't ask for this, then their ownership is not going to automatically transfer upon that other one's death.
That's exactly right. So, folks, if the deed does not mention the right of survivorship, it doesn't exist. You can answer the marriage questions right there. If I buy a house when I'm single and I get married later on down the road, is my spouse going to enjoy the right of survivorship in that property without knowing a damn thing about marriage? Is my spouse going to enjoy the right of survivorship? No, because they weren't even on the what?
Deed.
The deed.
They weren't even on the deed, so they certainly couldn't have the right of survivorship because it has to be mentioned where?
On the deed.
On the
now,
deed. And that is not going to change.
Don't go down rabbit holes. We'll talk about what other rights a spouse has that comes in later, but just know they don't have survivorship.
And I'm not answering marriage-based questions now because we're not talking about marriage right now. We're talking, and this is where you have to get yourself on the right track. We're talking about the right of survivorship. And I saw Eddie ask this question and Brian asked this question, and it is the pertinent question. Then where does the other owner's share go? That's where heirs come into the picture, folks. When an owner dies, when an owner dies, you got 2 choices with their share. Either it goes to the right of survivorship, and that's only if they have a co-owner and they ask for the right of survivorship on what document?
On the deed.
On the deed, or it goes to their heirs. So let me use as an example. Let's say that Haley bought a house with her significant other. The deed lists both of them, but it does not specify the right of survivorship. Everybody with me?
Yep.
Yes.
Haley's significant other is killed in a car accident.
Knock on wood.
Okay. Is Haley going to take over ownership of that property automatically through the right of survivorship?
No.
No.
No, because the deed doesn't say so. Does that make sense for everybody?
Right.
So what's
I think
the other option then?
Fair.
It goes to the deceased owner's heirs, which Haley may be. She may end up owning the property anyway, but only if she is that deceased person's heir, meaning that deceased person probably had what legal document in place?
A will.
A will, and named Haley as their heir.
Right.
Let me ask y'all a question, folks. Do young people have wills as a matter of routine? Most of them?
No.
No. What are the odds that Haley's significant other has a will?
Pretty slim.
Slim.
Slim. So Haley's significant other dies. They didn't ask for the right of survivorship. Is Haley going to be an heir to this person that she has no legal relationship to?
No.
No. If she's not named in a will, she has no legal relationship to him. Dating is not a legal relationship. She's not married to him. There's no legal relationship. She's going to end up owning that house with somebody's parent, somebody's brother, somebody's sister. How much of a mess is that going to be, folks?
A lot.
Good God.
And by the way, his parents hate her for whatever reason.
Oh, yay.
Could she not just buy his portion out?
She can try, but what if they literally bring hogs into the house and want to have hogs live in the house and shit on the floor? Can they
Trying to make her life difficult. Yes, they
Can
can.
they do that? Yes, because they're what?
Owner.
They're an owner.
They're an owner. Can they go set it on fire?
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's ours.
it's theirs. It's theirs, just like it's hers.
Uh-huh. And look, she said a big one, so she obviously must know.
Was that probably what was intended when these two people bought this property, or did they make a mistake by not asking for the right of survivorship? Most likely,
They made a mistake unknowingly.
they made.
Because a lot of people don't know about this.
Right.
Would we as the broker, would we be suggesting them to go to a lawyer for this? Is this
That's
where this
exactly
happens?
right. They need to talk to an attorney. That's always our advice when it comes to title issue. Okay. But here's the thing, folks. Somebody sent me this question privately. Well, couldn't you just have a will and name them as your beneficiary? Sure, but it's not nearly as good. Here's why. Y'all ready? Listen.
Yes. Listen, Amanda.
Here's the difference. I want you to imagine you starve and hungry. Starving. You got two options. You can have lunch right now because it's ready right now and we can let you eat, or you can wait 2 years until the court system figures out if that sandwich belongs to you. Which one do you want?
I'm gonna eat right now.
I want my sandwich now.
I know that's right.
Here's the difference between survivorship and leaving it in a will. When Haley's significant other dies, even if Haley's significant other names Haley as their heir, how long does it take to probate somebody's estate through the legal system, folks?
If she's listed as the heir,
Even if she's named as an heir in the will, how long does it take to probate somebody's estate through the legal
At least
system?
8 months.
I'm guessing.
probably, yeah.
Years in some cases.
COVID.
How long is it going to be until Haley actually owns this property by herself?
I mean, it could be almost a year.
It could be multiple years. It could be multiple. And by the way, if her significant other has debts, could that force the sale of the significant other's share in the property to pay off those debts and Haley still never get that half of the house?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Or they could have simply said on their deed they wanted the right of survivorship, in which case Haley would have taken over ownership when?
Right then.
They passed on.
Boom. As soon as that death certificate was filed, she would have been the owner. Which one's better?
Yep. Not eating right now.
Survivorship.
Survivorship.
Survivorship is a much stronger it's a much stronger legal idea than a will is. It always supersedes a will. It always, even if somebody dies with a will and their will says otherwise, which one are we going to follow? If they ask for survivorship on their deed, which one do we follow? If the will says one thing and survivorship says another, which one do we follow?
Survivorship.
Survivorship.
Are we starting to understand the importance of this right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, if these co-owners ask for that, what they're saying on their original deed is that they want the ownership to stay within this group. They're saying they want the ownership to stay within this group. Okay. And so that means the group by its very nature is going to get what with each death? What's going to happen?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
What is by its very nature, when we ask for the right of survivorship, don't think of 2 owners, think of 12. Okay. Every time one of them dies, the ownership group is going to get what?
Smaller.
Smaller and smaller, because nobody's share, if they ask for survivorship, nobody's share is going outside the group. It's staying what? It's being reabsorbed what?
Inside the group.
Yes.
Just like the game of Survivor. How many winners are there going to be eventually if multiple people purchase this property together and ask for the right of survivorship? What's going to be the end result?
One person owning the entire original.
One owner in severalty, because eventually all of the other owners have done what?
Died.
And every time one of those original owners dies, who asked for the right of survivorship, basically they're saying, I don't want my stuff after I die. I want my co-owner to have it. And that's what's going to happen. And so as each one dies, the shares get bigger because you have fewer and fewer owners sharing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So just for descriptive purposes, I'm imagining like a pie or a pizza, and every time somebody dies, you're like blending the lines and then reestablishing them.
So here's the thing. A couple of people have asked this question. There's no way to change the right of survivorship. No, it's on what document, folks?
The deed.
The pertinent deed.
Here's the disconnect you're having. You keep wanting to think, and I tried to show you this on Wednesday, but it hasn't sunk in yet. There's not one deed to a property. Every time you transfer ownership, isn't there a new what?
Deed. Permanent.
If Haley forgot to do this when they bought the property, there's nothing stopping Haley from buying the property again. Does Haley know who owns the property currently?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes. Does she have a pretty close relationship with the current owner of the property?
Yes.
Could she probably convince the current owner of the property, who, by the way, is her and her significant other, to sell the property to her and her significant other?
It might be hard.
Yes.
Can they sell it to themselves?
Yes.
And would that require a new deed because they're transferring ownership from themselves to themselves?
Re-deed, yes.
And on that new deed, could they now say, we want the right of survivorship?
Yes,
sir. I had to learn this.
Those that are struggling around about fixing a deed, you don't fix a deed. You replace it with a what?
New one. I had to learn this. Everything is not going to be perfect. So when you're talking about deeds, there might be a mistake on that one, and you can't just go back and fix it. You got to have a whole new one to fix whatever you're wanting to do on that last one, but you got to record a new one because it's there forever. You're never changing that deed.
You simply transfer ownership again. They sell the property to themselves and they add the right of survivorship this time.
Kind of messy.
And Alyssa said, is that done directly with the Register of Deeds? That's exactly right. That's the only place you need to go, the Register of Deeds office. You're probably going to have to involve an attorney to draft that new deed for you. So Deborah said, where do heirs come in? Heirs come in when the original owners don't ask for what? What right have the original owners not asked for?
Survivorship.
Do not ask for survivorship. And Travis, I know you're coming to this one too, but when we get down to that last owner in severalty, that's the only time.
That's it. That's it. Eventually, our heir is going to get involved here as well, even if they ask for survivorship.
Yes.
Yeah, because even when we get down to one owner, aren't they going to die?
Yeah.
So if the one owner dies, then it goes to their what?
Heirs.
Their heirs.
The heirs of the one survivor.
The lucky chosen ones.
Because everybody's going to die eventually. Okay.
Maybe in about 50 years, we'll have an answer to that.
I thought you were going to say we were taking lunch in 50 years. I thought you were answering Brendan's question. I was like, oh, that's no. We're going to be taking lunch in about 20 minutes or so, I think.
Okay.
So just remember,
go get your trash can, Brendan.
Just remember that survivorship is not automatically present. You have to ask for it, and you have to ask for it on what document?
Deed.
Your deed.
The deed.
Take ownership of the property. The only time survivorship is present is when the owners ask for that right on their deed when they take ownership of the property. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Now, here's why that's such an important distinction. How many different forms of concurrent ownership do we say that we were going to go over? Three. Here's why that's so important, the distinction of survivorship. Of the three, there's one where survivorship is not negotiable. Don't have a choice. There's one where survivorship is not possible. And there's one where survivorship is optional. That's why we got three different forms of concurrent ownership. So what we're going to talk about is the three different forms of concurrent ownership. And the one we're going to start with is the one where survivorship, actually, we got a question first. Let me activate this question. Got a little poll question here. So take a look at this. Betty, Tommy, and Selena purchase a property together as co-owners with the right of survivorship. Tommy dies 3 months after the purchase. Which is correct? A, Tommy's spouse, Mary, will inherit his share of the property ownership. B, Betty and Selena now own the property together as the only two owners. C, Tommy's will stating that he wishes for his share to go to his children will be honored. Or D, Betty and Selena must sell the property. Y'all like that B answer, huh?
I'm seeing a trend.
That's right.
B as in busted. Just kidding.
No, I like it too. That's the exact answer. Since they asked for the right of survivorship, what's going to happen is the ownership group just becomes smaller.
Yeah.
And when Tommy dies, it becomes Betty and Selena, right? Tommy's share just gets absorbed between them. Does that make sense for everybody? And yes. If you keep going, if Betty dies, how many owners will there be?
One. Selena.
Just one, just Selena. Is everybody good on that?
Yes.
Okay.
Eddie said he's calling his attorney on lunch.
But in that case, if what if Tommy was married? Like, isn't it like in general, like if the one spouse dies, the other spouse gets his or her?
We haven't. Don't go further than we are yet. Don't go further than we are yet. You can't. You just can't jump the gun on some of those questions. I understand the tendency to want to do that. You've got to make sure that you keep it in your lane. Keep it to what is being asked here. We're going to add wrinkles about marriage. Trust me, you're not going to want to add the marriage wrinkles. Don't be in a hurry to add marriage to it because it really does complicate answers, okay? Which is about what we're about to talk about, because the first type of concurrent ownership is ownership between, and hopefully I've explained this in a way that you're going to wrap your brain around this. Listen to the way I'm going to say this, because you're going to hear it differently, and the way you hear it differently is going to screw you on this test big time. I'm saying this very carefully for a reason. Tenancy by the entirety is a form of ownership between two people who are married at the moment they take ownership of the land. I'm going to say that again, and I'm saying it very carefully.
Listen to the words I repeat.
Exactly. It is tenancy by the entirety is ownership that is being taken by two people who are married at the moment they're taking ownership. In other words, when their names are written on the deed, they're already what? Married. This is not people who get married after they've taken ownership. This is not people who get married after they take ownership. Tenancy by the entirety refers to two people who are married first. What comes first, the wedding or the property?
The wedding.
The wedding.
Wedding. This is not people where the property comes before the wedding. Does that make sense for everybody?
Uh-huh.
The deed has to identify them. As a matter of fact, y'all saw it yesterday or Wednesday when we were going through those deeds. What did you notice that was on those deeds? A married couple, husband and wife, an unmarried man. What's always on a deed?
The couple names.
Marital status. Marital status, because we need to clearly identify at that moment, is this person what?
Married.
Because
it's going to change everything.
It changes everything, folks. But again, before I go into any of these details, are we talking about people who get married after they purchase property?
No.
Yeah.
No.
After. No, before.
We are talking about people who are already married.
Wedding first,
and then they purchase property as a married couple. Is everybody with me on that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I said that for a very specific reason. Notice I said, and they purchase property as a married couple. Y'all ready for this? As a married couple, you may not purchase property in any other way, first, folks.
What?
Welcome to being married. If you are married, at the moment you take ownership of any real property, whether you buy it, whether you inherit it, whether you are gifted it, if you are married at the moment that deed is written with your name on it, your spouse is a 50% owner of that property, even if they don't know about it. So you can do your little sneaky dirt all you want to and buy your mistress a house down the street, but guess who owns it with you?
Your spouse.
Your spouse does. And folks, I've seen that as a real estate agent. I had a lady call me one time and she said, I got a house I need you to sell.
Oh.
And I said, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
She said, well, let me give you the address. She gave me the address. I said, are you living in the property? She said, I'm not. I said, well, is there a tenant? She said, She said, somebody living there, but you ain't got to worry about her. I said, explain. She said, it's my house. She does not have a lease. I said, do you want to give me any more detail? She said, well, my husband died 2 weeks ago. I said, I'm sorry. She said, I'm not.
Oh, wow.
Okay. She said,
I like this chick.
Apparently he had a whole nother little side thing going on. And he thought he'd going to be slick a little while ago. He bought her a nice townhouse up in North Raleigh. According to my attorney.
How did he die?
That I didn't ask that question.
Don't matter.
I ain't getting into it. I just want my money.
Y'all, so now y'all fill in the blanks here. Was he married at the moment he took ownership of that property?
Yes.
He's stupid.
It doesn't matter that his wife doesn't know about the transaction. It doesn't even matter that her deed's not listed or her name's not listed on the deed. What word will show up beside his name on that deed?
Survivorship.
Married.
So Travis, if she did not know about it at the time that he bought it,
she didn't.
He dies.
And she didn't know about it.
How does she become aware of it then? Who lets her know?
When you go to the county courthouse and you file a death certificate, doesn't survivorship kick in on any property where there is the right of survivorship?
Yeah, okay.
And so as soon as his death certificate was filed, the clerk of court in that county said, well, wait a minute, this property has a co-owner because this married person just died. And since they were married at the time they took ownership of the property, then the spouse has the right of survivorship. We need to notify the spouse that she is now the owner of this. She got a letter from the clerk of court saying, you're now the sole owner of this property. And
so she dug him up and buried him upside down.
Yeah. And
So I got a question.
So she told me, she said, sell it.
I have a question. Okay. Going back to the other one. So now she can ask the person to leave, but if she doesn't, will it now turn into the estate of sufferance that she has to go through?
That's right. She's a tenant at sufferance. She had an estate at will.
Tenant at sufferance.
She becomes a tenant at sufferance.
But you said she didn't have a lease, though. Remember, she said
she had an estate at will. She had permit. Oh. And now she's a tenant at sufferance.
Damn. Get it, lady. She done went to her attorney. She said, according to my attorney.
And her attorney filed it. And I took the client. I sold that house. You know I did.
So basically all she had to do in the beginning was get the house put in her name and not his, and she would have been okay.
Well, that's what the mistress. The mistress, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, the mistress.
You the only one taking the mistress's side in this. I'm just telling you. Just ahead of me.
But who gonna care about her?
He's worried about the mistress.
And it's a valid question, down the line.
But
you gotta know.
Now, if her, but here's the thing. His name would have not had to be not on it at all, because if his name's on the deed, is his spouse going to have 50% ownership of whatever he has?
Yes. Oh my God, that's hilarious.
He's making a phone call right now. Get out.
So here's the thing. So the tenancy by the entirety is ownership that is taken when people are already what at that point in time?
Married.
Now notice this. By law, each spouse will have what share of ownership in the property, and this is not negotiable 50, unless they have 50. Like a prenuptial agreement or something like that.
50-50.
50-50. So even if one spouse pays for the entire thing, they both own it 50-50 if they purchase as a married couple.
And this is national, not just specific to North Carolina.
Correct. This is the way it's tested nationally. I'm not going to say this is the way it works in every single state. This is the way it works in North Carolina, and this is the most common way it works, and this is the way it's tested nationally.
Hey,
right. And go ahead, sir.
Well, this is kind of off topic, but I was just asking, you remember how you said there's a lot of legal things that we do? Are you going to try to teach us the legal way to get out of that?
A legal way to get out of tenancy by the entirety? There is such a thing called a free trader agreement, that your spouse has to agree to it. They have.
He's still wondering.
They have to knowingly give their ownership right. Imagine some questions is going to be asked.
I think he's worrying about his mistress. No, we're just picking. But just throwing a quick curveball. Another way that you could get tenancy by the entirety is if, somebody has a life estate and it says, and then it goes to Haley or somebody who's married.
Right.
Those people would inherit
it. As tenants by the entirety. And so
you can have fries. You can't have cupcakes.
As an example. So as an example.
Matrimonio, ¿quién puede,
I don't think she was talking to us.
No.
So as an example, like my family farm in Edgecombe County, if I were to be married at the time my parents pass away, I would, even though it'd be my parents, my family farm, I would inherit it with my spouse, because at the moment I'm taking ownership, it doesn't matter what the change, how that comes to be. The moment I take ownership, I'm married. Well, I'm not. So that would not be the case. But if I were, the moment you take ownership, if you're married, it becomes tenancy by the entirety.
And the only thing, I'm sorry, it just has to say married on the deed, right?
That's it. All it has to identify you as a married person. So prenuptial agreements supersede things like survivorship because they happen before things like survivorship. You're signing a prenuptial before
you sign it before you purchase. Okay, I am so sorry, Eddie. I put something a little different in the chat, but I guess what we're saying here is you signed a prenup before you buy the house.
That's exactly right, which is also why survivorship supersedes a will, because the survivorship predates the will and the execution of the will. And so it's all about the timing there. Okay.
So it's just making sure. And then wedding.
So,
right.
So Christina's asking about ownership of property between married couples where a property was bought before marriage. And I got to be so clear, we're not talking about that right now. We are not talking about that. We will come to that, but we are not talking about that, because if you pollute it, you will miss every single one of these questions. Because
we're going to have specific life scenarios that are going to make us think, okay, well, what would happen in my scenario? But you got to keep it very generic, and then we'll get to those ones a little bit later. Alyssa had asked a little bit earlier, so did he have the right of survivorship, talking about the dirt bag, on the mistress's deed? So it went to the wife, or since they were married before he bought the house, the right of survivorship was automatic?
First of all, the mistress doesn't have a deed. She wasn't identified as an owner on the deed. He had a deed with his name, but it identified him as married. And that is asking for survivorship. In North Carolina, if you are married, by being identified as married on your deed, you are asking for the right of survivorship. You are telling the courts that I want my spouse, right? And so this is the form of concurrent ownership where survivorship is automatic. If you are identified as married on the deed, you have the right of survivorship, whether you want it or not.
Right. And if you're married and you buy a house by yourself and somehow the person didn't get, I'd imagine that would be a dumb attorney who didn't put it on the deed, but I'm no attorney. But let's just say it's still survivorship, even if that one person goes and buys it and they're married.
You're still identified as married. Even if they don't identify who you're married to, they identify you as married, and they're required by law to, for this reason. For this reason.
So it's really tight with this tenancy by the entirety.
This is why deeds do identify marital status. And so Deborah brings up a great point that we're going to talk to about tenancy by the entirety. But here's an example of tenancy by the entirety. It says Tyson and Charlotte were married in 2018 and have recently purchased a home. Charlotte provided the entire down payment, and Tyson will make the monthly payments. In this case, the information about who made the down payment and who will make the monthly payments is useless. Tyson and Charlotte are tenants by the entirety. And the reason they're tenants by the entirety is the marriage came what? First. They own the property together 50-50, and they must do everything relating to the property together. I cannot stress enough that we're going to talk about this word right here. Tenants by the entirety have to do everything together. And Deborah put the common sort of statement to it. You can buy it by yourself. It might take one to buy, but you cannot sell it by yourself if you bought it when you were married, because for tenants by the entirety, it only takes one to buy, but it takes what?
Two to sell.
Two to sell, because the spouses must agree. This is the only form of shared ownership where the individual owners cannot act as individuals. They must act, the whole root of the phrase, as an entirety. They have to act as a group. Does that make sense, everybody?
No ifs and buts.
Okay. Now, if two people own property together before they get married to each other, and then they marry, they still are not tenants by the entirety. If one person owned the property and they get married, they still are not tenants by the entirety. Tenancy by the entirety is only reserved for those people who are married at the moment that deed is accepted.
Yep. One specific path to get here. One specific path to get to tenancy by the entirety. Married, purchase.
Yeah, Tanya said the ex was married but went to court on December 13th for their divorce. He bought the house on the 8th. That's a simple question. Doesn't matter when the deed's filed. Everybody look at it. It says somebody was married, but they were getting divorced on December 13th. On December 8th, they bought a house. Guess who they bought the house with?
Their spouse.
The other spouse owns 50% of that house.
Oh, man.
They sure do. By law. Because separated ain't a legal status. You're either married or you're divorced. That's it. Okay. So getting married does not change the form of ownership. If two people own the property, if one person owns the property in severalty before they get married. Now this, Christine, is starting to get toward the answer to your question, your burning question. If one person before marriage owned the property in severalty and then they get married, how does the property ownership stay?
Severalty.
ownership in severalty.
Unless
the deed doesn't
unless
change.
they say, oh no, it's bought already, you said.
They bought it, but they owned it before they got married.
But when they get married, they can do it. They can record a new deed
They
with survivorship.
They can, but simply getting married does not change
Right.
everything or anything. It's
And the reason we are being so specific and coming back to what it is because this is how the test questions are going to come up. It's not going to be, but can they redeed later? Well, sure they can. And I understand why everyone is asking this because it is important stuff to know for real life situations. But the test questions are going to come as this person was single, then they got married and they bought a house, then they got married. What's the ownership?
It's still ownership in severalty. If the two people bought it together, but they were single, they're not going to be tenants by the entirety because now they've married each other. It's not going to change anything in that regard. And as far as the form of ownership, does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
We're going to talk about a marital interest here in just a second. And that's an important thing, but it doesn't change the form of ownership. Here's what does happen. Single property owners who own the property in severalty by themselves and then get married do lose some rights. Their ownership does not change. They are still an owner in severalty. However, in North Carolina and in most states, marrying someone ties your finances to that person. And in North Carolina, like in most states, marrying someone creates what's called a marital interest in everything that that person owns. The problem with a marital interest is nobody knows how much that relates to. It could be 0%, it could be 10%, it could be 50%, it could be 100%, it could be anywhere. And you'll never know until you get divorced. That's the only time. So, Christina, finally, we come to the answer to your question. Your husband owned the house before you got married. Now you're married. If you have not touched that deed, you have an unknown marital interest in that property. And the only way you will find out how much of a marital interest you have in that property is to divorce that person. And then it would be up to the divorce judge what percentage of ownership you had. It is an unknown gray area. That's why there's this common misconception that the new spouse now owns half your house. They don't. They have some interest, which means if you want to sell the property, you probably need to get them to sign off on you selling the property. You will need to get them to sign off on you selling the property, but there's nothing in the law that says they own a certain percentage. That would only be found out if you got a divorce or if you redeeded the property to yourself. If you redeed the property to yourself, now that you're married, what would the ownership be?
50-50.
It would be tenancy by
50-50.
50-50 with the right of survivorship. Here's another great point, Christina. Assuming you've not changed the deed on that property, assuming you've not replaced the deed, redeeded the property, do you and your spouse have the right of survivorship in that property?
No.
No. Do not. What that means is if your spouse were to die, you would have to wait for the probate process, and there is no guarantee that that probate process will go the way that you think it will be. They could leave the property to somebody else. Okay. So, redeeding it would certainly be the way to put it on lockdown. Is that making sense for everybody?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. It takes a while to get to that answer. It really does. So look at this question. Tyrus is a single property owner who purchased a home in Garner in 2008 in Severalty. In 2010, he married Tia. Which statement is correct? A, Tyrus still owns the property in Severalty and may sell it at any time without input from Tia. B, Tyrus and Tia own the property as tenants by the entirety. C, Tyrus and Tia each have a 50% ownership interest in the property. Or D, Tyrus and Tia are co-owners with Tia having an unknown level of ownership granted by marital interest.
A couple of you guys got a little trigger happy.
Mm-hmm. We can eliminate two of them. They're not going to be tenants by the entirety. Can we all agree on that?
Yeah.
Yes.
And they're not going to be 50-50 because nothing says they have to be 50-50 since they're not tenants by the entirety. So that leaves us with the two choices. Tyra still owns the property in Severalty. I agree with that part. And may sell it at any time without input from Tia. Bang. Because Tia has that unknown what?
Marital
interest in the property. And that's why D is a better answer. Tyrus and Tia are co-owners, with Tia having an unknown level of ownership granted by marital interest. That's the better answer.
Because someone with a marital interest still has a co-ownership type of status.
They have a legal claim to the ownership of that property. We just don't know how much of a legal claim they have.
Right. If they didn't sign off when selling the property, there would be an unresolved, or I forget what it's called.
It would be a cloud on the title.
Cloud on the title. Somebody might have an ownership interest if that spouse who has a marital interest, didn't sign off on the sale.
Exactly right.
Not to go down a rabbit hole, but would it depend on how many years they were married as to this unknown?
It might depend to the judge. That would be up to the judge in that divorce proceeding.
Just curious.
Yep. They would look at all kinds of factors, I'm sure, and probably factors like who cheated on who and all that stuff gets involved in divorce proceedings.
I know this is kind of weird, but can you please say, is it severalty?
Severalty?
Several.
So like the word several, and there's T on the end.
Okay, severalty. Thank you.
Severalty. Nope, that's not weird at all. So look at this one. Rudy and Amanda purchased a home together 1 year after they were married to each other. Unfortunately, they are now seeking a divorce. Which statement is likely true regarding the future ownership of the property? A, Rudy and Amanda cannot continue to own the property as concurrent owners. B, Rudy and Amanda cannot remain tenants by the entirety. C, Rudy and Amanda only have the option of selling the property. Or D, Rudy and Amanda must decide which one of them will own the property after the divorce. And be careful not to choose things just because you've seen them. Oh, that's how it worked when my cousin got divorced. Make sure you're choosing answers, and I would always steer clear of those harsh answers. Must, always, only.
I'm liking the way most of y'all think. 42, 43.
Rudy and Amanda cannot remain tenants by the entirety because they're no longer what?
Married.
Can they continue to own the property together?
Yes.
As something other than tenants by the entirety. Because can't any two unmarried people continue to own property together?
Yes.
They're just not married to each other anymore. So they can certainly continue to own the property together. So that eliminates A, that eliminates C, and then D might be the most common outcome. Maybe that's the most common outcome, that one of them gets involved, but that's not required. Could they share ownership of that property after the divorce?
Yes.
Yes. If that's what they decide they want to do, or if that's what the divorce judge orders them to do, that's what they're going to do. But the one thing that simply can't happen is they cannot remain tenants by the entirety. And yes, once divorced, there would need to be a new deed, because their current deed refers to them as a married couple, and that's no longer true. Okay. It could be tenants in common or joint tenants, which we're going to talk about after the lunch break. But it can't be tenancy by the entirety. All right, y'all ready for some lunch?
Yes.
Yeah, I need to go walk or something.
We talked about the first type of shared ownership or concurrent ownership. They mean the same thing. Shared ownership and concurrent ownership mean the same thing. And if you haven't picked up by now, folks, that you really need to be writing notes profusely, I don't know what to tell you, because you only remember like 10% of what you hear. Even with me yelling it might get you to 20%, maybe. That's why I yell, because it amplifies and it puts an exclamation point on your brain. But you need to write it. You need to do it. Don't rely on the slides that are already there. That's a starting point, because otherwise you're going to find yourself just so scattered and lost with this stuff. You need to make it your own.
Mm-hmm.
So before lunch, we talked about the first type of shared ownership, concurrent ownership. What was the one we talked about before lunch?
Entirety.
Tenancy by the entirety.
Mm-hmm.
Tenancy by the entirety. So give me the definition of tenancy by the entirety, not stuff we know about it, but what's the definition of tenancy by the entirety? How many owners?
Two.
Two. And what do we know about those two owners?
They're already
married.
by deed.
They're married when?
Married when they purchased the property.
When they took ownership of the property, whether it was a purchase, whether it was a gift, no matter how they took ownership, they were married at the moment they took ownership of the property. That is tenancy by the entirety. Okay. And we talked about how that means that they're required to be 50-50 owners, that one cannot sell without the permission of the other. And most importantly, what right is automatically present when they own it as tenants by the entirety?
Survivorship.
The right of survivorship. Now we want to move the conversation along to another type of shared ownership. And these are going to be co-owners who have a choice of doing tenancy by the entirety. Of doing survivorship or not. They are not tenants by the entirety. So therefore, survivorship is not automatic for them. Which means, what do we know about these people? That we know they're not one thing.
Married.
Not married.
Not married to each other, right? We know these co-owners that are taking ownership of this property are not married to each other, because if they were married to each other, they'd be tenants by the entirety. So these are people who are taking ownership of property, purchasing or inheriting or being gifted, whatever it is, they're taking ownership of the property together at the same time. And they're saying, yes, we know we're not married, but we would like to have this right of survivorship. Now, remind me again, give me the definition of the right of survivorship. What is the right of survivorship? What are they asking for when they ask for this right of survivorship?
Ownership.
It all stays in the circle.
It all stays in the circle.
There you go. It stays within the circle. That as one owner dies, the circle is going to get smaller. It's going to be reabsorbed into that original group. Is everybody okay with that? Now, again, when do they have to choose this?
Or they're
at the time
when they buy.
When they first take ownership of the property. If that's a purchase, when they buy the property. If it's an inheritance, when they inherit the property. If it's a gift, when they're gifted the property. But the minute they accept a deed with their name on it as the grantee, they have to say what on that deed? We want what?
Survivorship.
Survivorship.
We want the right of survivorship. And here's how you say that, folks. You ask to be joint tenants. That is the request for survivorship. You ask for survivorship. Now, if you're married, do you have to say we want to be joint tenants, or can you just identify that you're married and that takes care of it?
Just identify that you're married.
Identify that you're married, because it's already compulsive.
Right? But these are co-owners, co-purchasers, whatever you want to call them, who are not married to each other, but for whatever reason, they've decided they want to keep the ownership within the group. Mm-hmm. And so at the moment they purchase on their deed, it has to say they want to be what?
Joint tenants.
Joint tenants with the right of survivorship.
Well, and it will usually say with the right of survivorship, but I'm telling you, for test taking purposes, joint tenancy means the right of survivorship. They are inseparable. You do not have to see both. Don't get so caught up. But I didn't see survivorship. If it says joint tenancy, folks, what does it mean?
Survivorship. This is where you can assume.
Right. Because, folks, you're asking for survivorship by asking to be joint tenants. There's no reason to ask for joint tenancy if you don't want what right?
Survivorship.
the right of survivorship. So these are people who have decided that if something happens to one of them, and keep in mind, there's no limitation anymore that we're talking about 2 co-purchasers. Could we be talking about 10 owners here, right here, right now?
Yes.
Are they coming and going at different times, or are they all taking ownership at the same time?
Same time.
Same time.
They're
The
all
time of
taking
purchase.
ownership at the same time, because to have the right of survivorship, it has to be specified where?
At the time of purchase and the deed.
On the deed at that moment. So it has to happen all at once. Everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Okay. And so they ask for this right of survivorship. Now, what that means, and if you notice, it says that right here, anybody wishing to be a joint tenant co-owner must have purchased at the same time as all the other owners. They must have the same, be on the same deed, listed with each other all at the same time. Okay. It usually means equal shares. You are free to make that assumption for test questions. If they say there's 4 owners and you're joint tenants, they're 25% each. If there's 10 owners and they're joint tenants, they're 10% each. You can assume that it means equal shares, because if you think about it, it makes sense to do equal shares, because at the end, how many people are going to end up with this thing anyway? If you do joint tenancy and you have the right of survivorship, how many are going to end up owning this thing anyway at the end?
One.
One, the survivor, the one that lives the longest. This is like a prize for being the oldest.
Right.
Among your co-owners. And remember that right of survivorship is stronger than a will. So even if a will says something contradictory, which one are we going to follow?
Survivorship.
Survivorship.
I was looking at you.
Okay. I don't want you to look at me. It makes me nervous.
Wait, what is that? No, one of the cool things though that I think about joint tenancy is that the individual owners can still sell their shares.
There you go.
Which I know you're getting to.
Look at that first bullet point on this slide right here. It says a joint tenant, and this is where we get very different from tenancy by the entirety. A joint tenant can sell their share of the property's ownership at any time, whether the other co-owners approve or not. So if there are 4 that purchase together, can one of them decide spur of the moment that they want out? They want to sell their share to somebody else?
Yes.
They can. Can the other 3 do anything about that?
No,
they cannot.
But if you think about it, that's...
Go ahead.
Yep. I was just going to say, that's what you started out with. You were saying, just reflect on these questions. Do we need all of the owners to agree before we sell? And you were saying, don't answer that yet, because it is a loaded question. And now you see why.
Question. And here's the thing. Do we need all the owners to agree to sell the entirety of the property? Sure, because we're selling the entirety of the property to someone. Yep. As Elizabeth said, we're selling the whole pie. They each have their own piece of the pie. But can they individually sell their slice of the pie if they want? Yes, absolutely. And so, Jay, in some ways, it is sort of like owning shares of stock, in the sense that one owner is not limited by what the other owners do. Okay? Now, that's very different than tenancy by the entirety, which that's in tenancy by the entirety, one owner is not allowed to do anything without the other owner agreeing. Is everybody okay with that? Okay. So now that we've said, yes, these owners can individually sell, we need to remember one of the golden rules of joint tenancy. If you are a joint tenant, you must have been around for the entirety of the group. You cannot arrive late to the group as a joint tenant. So if there are originally 4 owners and they're joint tenants, and I'm just going to use 4 of you that are in a row right here, Shay, Jay, Mark, and Sharon. Y'all are in a row on my screen. Shay, Jay, Mark, and Sharon buy a property together as joint tenants. Can Sharon decide to sell her 25% share without consulting with the other 3?
Yes.
Yes, she can. But when Travis purchases that 25% share and comes in as a new owner. Now
he will not be a joint tenant.
Jay and Mark have to deal with that. They have a new owner that they have to share ownership with, but they don't have to share one very important characteristic with Travis, the new owner. Travis has not been there for the whole party. And folks, I don't know about you, but I don't share if you weren't there to put in on this thing.
That's right.
You can't participate in the joint tenancy, that is, if you weren't there from the very beginning. Can Travis buy into the property later on?
Yes.
Yes, but is he going to come in as a joint tenant, or does he have to come in? Is he too late? Has he missed the boat on the joint tenancy?
It's too late.
He's too late. He's too late. And here's why that's important, folks. Listen. It's coming on the test. Does he get the benefit of the right of survivorship? Even if he's the last one alive, is he going to benefit from survivorship?
No.
No, because he was not there from the beginning. Only those joint tenants who were there from the very beginning get to participate in the right of survivorship. I'm going to say that again. Only the joint tenants who were there from very day one on that purchase, on that first deed of the group, when the group was created, those are the only people who can benefit from survivorship. So yes, Sharon can sell her share to Travis, but he's not going to take over her place as a joint tenant. There's going to be 4 owners, but only 3 of them are going to be joint tenants. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
And here's why that's important. Let's take that one step further. I'm gonna back up for just a second. So here's our original group, Shay. I'm gonna do it in little boxes here so we can divide it off. We got Shay, we got Jay, Mark, and we said Sharon, right?
Yes.
Yep.
And they are all joint tenants with each other. I'm gonna mark these all as being joint tenants because they all bought at the same time, which means if something were to happen to any of them at that moment, their share would be absorbed within the group, correct?
Correct.
Yep.
Correct.
So now let's say that Sharon sells her share to Travis. So we have Shay, we have Jay, we have Mark, and now we have Travis.
Can you do that in like a different color?
Okay.
That's all right.
So let's label these now. Shay, was she around from the beginning?
Yes.
Yes.
So she's still a joint tenant, right?
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Jay, was he around from the beginning?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Still a joint tenant. Mark, was he around from the beginning?
Yes.
Yes.
Still a joint tenant. Travis, was he around from the beginning?
No.
No.
Okay. We're going to talk about it in a second. It's called tenant in common, but we'll put more of a label on that. Here's why that's important. Moving forward, if Jay dies, sorry, Jay. If Jay dies, is the joint tenancy going to kick in at that point?
Yes.
Yes.
The right of survivorship. Is it?
No.
Oh,
It
it's
will.
not.
Shay and Mark.
A joint tenant just died. If a joint tenant dies, where does their share go?
Automatically to the other joint tenants.
Back into the group, but only the group that are still what?
Joint
tenants.
Joint tenants left.
Joint tenants. So what it's going to look like after Jay dies is like this. You're going to have Shay, you're going to have Mark, and you're going to have Travis, but Travis is going to have a much smaller share because he couldn't benefit from what?
Joint tenancy. So it would remain that little 25%.
That's right.
It would remain 25.
So if we were to put percentage labels on here, they all started. We were at like 25, 25, 25, 25. And that was still here, 25, 25, 25.
Shay and Mark 25. Would have to sell that share to get a fourth roommate again.
I'm so sorry, Brendan. It was breaking up.
Yeah, Brendan, you might need to stop your video for a second because your audio was really garbled. But so now Travis still has 25%, but Shay and Mark both have, I think it's 37.5%.
Hey, you're better at the math than me.
Because they benefited from the survivorship because they are still what?
Joint tenants.
Joint tenants.
Survivor.
And if you now, so let's continue to play the game. Let's say Travis dies.
Okay.
What happens to his share? Travis dies. He is
his heir.
Shay and Mark. It goes to his heir.
Goes to his heir.
It goes to his heirs. We're just going to put TH, right? Because he is not a joint tenant. He is a tenant in common. So his share always stays the same and always goes to his heirs. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep.
So now you would have Shay over here with her 37.5, and you'd have Mark here with his 37.5. And you'd have Travis's heirs there with their 25. Is everybody good with that?
Yes.
Yep.
And then we could potentially go one final step and we could say, okay, well, what happens if Shay dies? Well, if Shay dies and she's a joint tenant still and Mark's still a joint tenant and Travis is a tenant in common, if Shay dies, what happens to her share?
Mark
goes
to Mark.
It goes to Mark. What happens to Travis's heirs share?
Stays the same.
Stays the same.
Stays the same at that 25%. And now Mark is over here
75.
at 75%. Does everybody see how that works?
Yes.
Yes.
We have to do the percentages.
Well, they'll generally ask on the test, yeah, but I mean they're going to use like thirds and quarters. They're not, I mean, it's not going to be any sort of math question. But does everybody see why Travis can't, and not only Travis, but his heirs can never benefit from the survivorship because they came to the party what?
Late.
And if you weren't there at the beginning, you're not going to be a joint tenant. Okay. Now, Eddie said, what if Mark dies at this point? If Mark dies at this point, the joint tenancy's over, folks, because how many does it take to have a joint?
Two. Well, one.
Well, this kind of joint, it takes two, right? And we don't have two joint tenants. We have two owners, but one of them's a tenant in common. So at this point, the joint tenancy, the survivorship is over. So everything is heirs from this point forward. The heirs, more heirs, you know.
Oh.
Unless they sell.
So can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
So yeah, that's what my question was. So like say Shay or Mark wanted to sell a share out before they got down to one left it would be to a tenant in common and it would just be.
That's right. Okay. Any sale converts that share to tenancy in common. Doesn't convert the whole, just that share.
But so if Shay didn't die, if Shay didn't die, Mark would still have 75%. No.
If Shay didn't die, if Shay's still alive, and you have Shay with her 37.5 and Mark with his
so I'd have 37.5, but then you'd have another tenant in common with 37.5.
Oh, you mean if she sold her share?
Instead of dying.
Yes, right. If she sold her share, then there would be a tenant in common that had that 37.5. Mark would have his 37.5 and Travis's heirs would have their 25.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. Are there instances where there are a large number of people in these relationships? Absolutely. There, obviously, the bigger the numbers get, the more rare it is to have a bunch of different property owners. But you do see this. You do see joint tenancy. You know, absolutely. Okay. Once survivorship is done, then it has to go to heirs. Exactly. There's no such thing as dying together, Shay. Somebody's death certificate is going to be listed before the other. For legal purposes, you'll never see two people listed as dying simultaneously, even if they die in a car
In a plane crash.
In a plane crash, even in a plane crash, little known fact, every single passenger on that plane crash will get issued a different time of death by a microsecond.
Wow.
For legal purposes such as this. Because what if here's why. What if you got a husband and wife on the plane? Okay. Whichever one dies first, doesn't their share of the property go to the other?
Yep.
Right. But if the other one then also dies, we got to know whose will to look at. So does it matter if the husband died first or the wife died first? The answer is yes, because could they have two different wills?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, and so they will be issued two different times of death.
I'm hoping that we don't have to worry about
You
that.
don't. You don't.
I'm not getting on a plane with you, Shay.
You never know.
I'm going to be looking for you.
So one of the things that helps me remember this, and whether it helps you or not, I don't know. I always have remembered that whenever there's joint tenancy, that share is not going to heirs. And so here's what I remember. What are people's most common when you think of heirs? Heirs could be anybody. It could be anybody you name in a will. It could be anybody the state chooses as your heir. But what's the most common heir that we think of? When we think of our heirs, what's the most common thing we think of? Children. Our children. And so here's the way I think of it. You would never pass a joint to your kids. I don't care who you are, how liberal your mindset is, you're just not going to pass a joint to your kids. And that always stuck with me as joint tenancy does not go to heirs. If that share is owned by a joint tenant and that person dies, you look for other surviving joint tenants. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
Yes.
You only look but see, here's the thing, Gabby. There's no such thing as all the joint tenants dying. There's going to be one at the end. And that one is no longer a joint tenant. Once we get down to one, what do we call them? An owner in what?
Entirety.
Not entirety.
Severalty. I'm sorry.
Oh, several.
Once we get down to one, they're an owner in severalty. And where does somebody who owns something in severalty, where does their stuff go when they die?
They're heirs.
They're heirs, right? And so once we get down to where there's no more at least two joint tenants and it becomes ownership in severalty, then of course it goes to that person's heirs. Once we run out of joint tenants, then it's got to go to heirs. But as long as there are still joint tenants remaining, survivorship is in play. Does everybody key in on that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. As long as you still have joint tenants alive, you're going to focus on the survivorship. So like, look at this one. It says Vance and Corey have decided to purchase a warehouse together and wish to make sure that ownership stays within the two of them. So they purchased the property as joint tenants. This means that if Vance were to die, his share would automatically and immediately go to Corey because of the right of survivorship. It does not matter, and this is where you're going to have to be careful on a test. It does not matter if Vance has heirs, if Vance has a spouse, children. It doesn't matter if his will says something differently. What's more important, heirs and wills or survivorship?
Survivorship.
So do not let them talk you out of that on the test. I don't care if he has a will that says it goes to his kids. If he owns the property as a joint tenant with this other person, it's going to that other person through the right of survivorship. Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Good. So now we've covered two forms of what we call concurrent ownership. What does concurrent mean again? Remind me again.
Shared.
Shared. More than one owner at the same time. Very good. Very good. Okay. So we talked about tenancy by the entirety. How many owners do we have of tenancy by the entirety?
That's two owners.
Two.
They're married.
Married.
What do we know about
They're married.
They're married.
Wife.
them? Married to each other, right?
Yes.
Then we talked about joint tenancy. What do we know about them? They're not what?
They're not married.
They're not married.
Husband and wife. Yeah.
Time of purchase, right?
Yes.
But they did want the right of survivorship. That's why they asked to be joint tenants.
They purchase it at the same time.
They're purchasing at the same time. Very good. Very good. We know that about joint tenants.
Most of the time it's equal shares, right?
Most of the time it's equal shares, and you're
Yes.
free to assume it's equal shares for test taking purposes, because it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make sense to do unequal shares when it's all going to end up with one anyway, right? Like, what does it matter? Like, what point would there be? Two people buy and I own 90% and somebody else owns 10%. Well, shit, if I die, aren't they going to own 100% anyway if we're joint tenants?
Yes.
So with joint tenancy, it just makes sense to do equal shares, because you're you're recombining in the group anyway. Now, if you really want to protect your turf, you would not be joint tenants. If you wanted to protect your turf and make sure your share stays with you and your heirs, you would choose to be what as a co-owner with your co-purchaser?
Tenants in common?
A tenant in common. Tenancy in common is for co-purchasers, and it could be 2, 10, 5,684, any number, it doesn't matter. Any unlimited number of co-owners who do not want the right of survivorship between them. In other words, each individual, when they die, their share will go where?
Their heirs.
Their heirs.
Their heirs, either the heirs that they name in a will, or the heirs that are chosen for them by the state of North Carolina. Their share will go to their heirs. Those are tenants in common. They have made that choice. They don't want the right of survivorship. They chose, for whatever reason, not to have the right of survivorship, and they're certainly allowed to do that unless they're married. You know, if married, you get tenancy by the entirety, whether you want it or not. But when you're unmarried, you get to choose. And tenancy in common is this is the default. If two people who are not married or four people purchase property together and they don't say we want to be joint tenants, guess what they're going to be by default?
Tenants in common.
Shay, you had a question?
Yeah, because this was tripping me up, before. So with the right of no survivorship is, like you're saying, for tenants in common. So when you were saying that survivorship is basically ownership or first dibs, like I would get it if I wanted, if I'm not going to use Sharon passed away, I would get it if we were joint tenants.
If you were joint
tenants in common.
Right. And it's not first dibs, you get it automatically. It's not selling.
I would have the right to survivorship.
Right, which means you get share and share automatically when she dies.
Okay. Whereas the tenancy in common, I don't want that right. So
Correct.
I basically give up that right to say I want it.
That's right. In other words, so think about it this way. Let me ask you a question, Shay. If you and Raquel bought a property together, do you know Raquel?
No.
Yeah. If you all bought a property together, do you think you'd want to be joint tenants, or do you think you'd want to be tenants in common? I want you to sit there and think about it for a second. Think about you, think about your family, think about the people you want to look after and take care of. Do you think you'd want to be joint tenants, or you want to be tenants in common? Because this will help you understand it better than anything. Which one would you want to be, Shay, if you're buying property?
Probably tenants in common, because I don't know that.
And why? What would that result in that's better for you?
No survivorship.
Exactly, because you would want your share to go where?
Yes. To my heirs.
Give the lady a hand, folks, right there. She just decided what type of title she wants to take in that property that she buys with Raquel. If she wants it to go to her heirs, they're going to be tenants in common. If she wanted her share to go to Raquel, if something happens to her, they would be what? Joint tenants.
Joint tenants.
There you go. Madison, do you have a question?
Yeah, so with joint tenancy, the right of survivorship's automatic, but why would you have to specify on the deed yourself that you did have the right of survivorship? Unless
you really don't, for your purposes on the test. We like to have it specified just to be abundantly clear, but you do not need to worry about that. That is deeper in the weeds than you need to be. Joint tenancy means survivorship.
So there is no option to not have the right of survivorship with joint tenancy.
It's not going to ever work that way. Because what would you simply do if you think about it? What's the whole purpose of joint tenancy?
You'd be
So
tenants
you
in
can
common.
have.
There you go. You'd be, for all practical purposes.
I wanted to specify with that. Okay.
There you go. Okay. Christina, what are you asking? So who gets joint tenancy and what's the benefit of that? Anybody who is purchasing property with a co-owner and they want the co-owner to get their share. I would think two people who were dating but not married. You think they'd want to be joint tenants or tenants in common?
Joint tenants.
I'd say they probably want to be joint tenants.
Really?
Two people who are, yeah. You want to own the house with somebody's mama?
No thanks.
Wait, could you say it again? Because I think I just confused myself.
If you have two people that are dating, but they're not yet married and they're buying a house together, do you think they want to be joint tenants or you think they want to be tenants in common?
Tenants in common.
Joint tenants.
I would say joint tenants.
Joint tenants.
I would say joint tenants. They
Because
want
they get the
the other
survivorship.
person that they're buying the property with to get their share if something happens to them.
Right.
Remember,
If
you
they
don't want to
left-
be an owner with the hog.
Right. If they're sitting there smoking a joint and the other one gets up and leaves, they don't want somebody else to come up and share it with them.
Here's the thing, y'all are focused too much on.
Okay.
You're focused. You're not focused on when it matters. It only matters if you what?
You
Die.
If you die, folks. For all practical purposes, while you're alive and own the property together, is there any difference at all in joint tenancy and tenancy in common?
No.
Not much, really.
Not
Not when you're
zero.
alive.
Not much. Zero. There is zero difference between joint tenancy and tenancy in common while these people are alive. It only matters when one of them
Somebody
what?
dies.
Yeah.
Somebody dies.
When one of them dies. It is a simple question. If the person you're buying the property with, your co-owner, if you would want them to get your share or you would want to get their share if something happened to them, then y'all need to be what?
Joint tenants.
Joint tenants. If you would want to have the freedom to leave your share to somebody else and you expect them to leave their share to somebody else, you would want to be what?
Tenants in common.
Tenants in
Tenants in common. That's literally all it is, folks.
Okay.
That's it. Samantha, you okay? Speak up if you're not.
Travis,
Nobody ever asked me if I'm okay.
Well, we know the answer.
Travis, didn't you use like the same-sex marriage before it was legal? That was most likely.
So that is a perfect example and segue. So I've been in this business for almost 20 years now. For a very long time. If I had clients who were a same-sex couple, they were not married. And why were they not married? They couldn't be married to each other. Do you think that people who are a same-sex couple, maybe they've spent 20, 30, 40 years together and they're buying a house together, do you think they want their share to be tied up in court and probate and wills and all of that stuff? Or would they want their share to go to their significant other much the same as it would if they were married? And they probably would be married, but they couldn't be at that point in time. Which one do you think they wanted?
Go to the other partner.
The other partner. And so what do you think was the smarter choice for them to be?
Joint tenancy.
Joint tenants. That's all it is, folks. That's all it is. How we feel?
Okay, I'm good.
Okay. So if a tenant in common dies, it's going to go to the heirs. First place we look for heirs is a will. If they don't have a will, then we look to like that lineage type thing. Do they have a spouse? Do they have children? Do they have parents? Do they have siblings? That's when we look to the lineage thing. But will takes so what sits above your natural heirs? Your will. What sits above your will?
Survivorship.
There you go. Does that make sense for everybody? So like survivorship is the most important legal right when it comes to death of a property owner. One step down from survivorship, if survivorship's not present, then what document do we look for?
Will.
Will. If they didn't have survivorship and they didn't have a will, that's when we go to, okay, who are their living relatives? Everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Okay. Right, Barbara, next of kin. Okay. Jay said survivorship can only be indicated via a deed, correct? Yes, the deed has to specify and what's the two ways a deed can specify the right of survivorship?
Staying married.
Say that they're married. So they're
joint tenancy.
Or joint tenants.
That's the two ways a deed specifies survivorship. It either says that they're married or it says they're joint tenants. Either one of those, you got survivorship, baby. If it says it's tenants in common, do you have survivorship?
No.
Sorry.
Okay.
Our Uncle Sam will take it.
How do we all feel about that? Pretty good?
Yes.
Okay. Josh, it is important to kind of know in general the priority list. I don't think you need to have it memorized, but it's relatively straightforward. I mean, spouse comes first, then children, then parents and siblings. But yeah,
if you don't have a will, it's important.
Yeah, right. If you don't have a will, of course, the way to avoid this whole sort of priority picking order is to have a will.
Right.
Okay. So look at this. Barry, Kathy, and Doretha purchased a property together in 2010 as joint tenants. In 2014, Barry decided to sell his share to Terry. In June of 2021, Doretha died. What is the current status of the ownership of the property? So let's work our way through this. When Barry, Kathy, and Doretha purchased the property in 2010, what share did each of them own? What do y'all think? Since they weren't specific, what do we assume?
1/3.
1/3.
1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
1/3. I agree. Okay. Did they have survivorship in 2010?
Yes.
Yes.
Because it said they were what?
Joint tenants.
Joint tenants.
Is Barry allowed to sell his share to Terry? Yes.
Good job.
Will Terry be a joint tenant or must she be a tenant in common?
Tenant in common.
Will be a tenant in common. So just in case you're keeping score, here's what we're going to look like at that point in time. Okay. Barry's no longer there. We've got Terry here, right? And she's a tenant in common. And then we've got Kathy. Now, Kathy is from the original cruise, so she's a what?
Tenant.
Joint tenant.
Doretha is from the original cruise, so she's a what?
Joint tenant.
Joint tenant.
So it says what happens when Doretha dies. What happens when Doretha dies? You see joint tenant.
He becomes a tenant in severity.
Kathy becomes a tenant in common.
Kathy is in severalty.
Well, she's not in severalty. She has a co-owner.
Goes to Kathy.
And then
the shares would go to Kathy, but Terry would still be a tenant in common.
Terry would have 1/3. So let's sum it up. Terry has how much still?
1/3. As a tenant in common.
As a tenant in common, and Kathy would have what?
2/3.
2/3 as a tenant in common.
As a tenant in common.
Because it's more than one owner.
Right.
And nobody has survivorship at that point.
Right.
And at that point, all Terry and Kathy could leave them to their heirs in the will.
That's right. Because there's no more joint tenancy. All that's been exhausted at this point.
Right. Tenancy in common.
Eddie, if they can sell to anybody you want to, but as soon as you have any change, it's going to eliminate the joint tenancy for that share. And if you're combining shares, it would probably eliminate for two, but you're not going to get asked that on the test. It's deeper than we go. Can you do that on the test?
Woo! Yes.
Okay. So look at this one. It says Tyler, Brenda, and Sharika purchased a beach house as joint tenants in 2008. In 2010, Tyler sells his ownership interest to Adam. A few months after this purchase, Adam dies suddenly. Which statement is true of the ownership of the property? I'm going to give you a second to read through it. I'm not going to read them out to you. I'm going to give you a second to read through it. You tell me which one you think.
few months after.
Trigger happy.
I would say make sure you draw these out so you can visually see what's happening.
No, Brenda and Sharika now own the property. They still own it.
Yeah.
One answer is better than the other here. I'm going to click routine mute.
All right, so let's talk about it. It says Tyler, Brenda, and Sharika purchased the beach house as joint tenants in 2008. So that's why I highlighted them all yellow. They're all joint tenants. So do they have the right of survivorship?
Yes.
Yes. In 2010, Tyler sells his ownership interest to Adam. First of all, can he do that?
Yes.
Yes.
He can. So Tyler goes away and Adam comes in. But does Adam stay a joint, that come in as a joint tenant, or does
In common.
that goes away? He is a tenant in common. Oops, the highlighter. Sorry. Box back that I erased. So Adam comes in as a tenant in common. Does everybody agree with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Because he's new. A few months after this purchase, Adam dies suddenly. So are we talking about a tenant in common that dies, or are we talking about a joint tenant that dies?
Tenant in common.
We're talking about a tenant in common that dies, which means tenants in common always leave their stuff to who?
Their
Heirs.
Their heirs. So we've got Adam's heirs. And of course, they're still also a tenant in common. Does everybody agree with that?
Right.
Yep.
Right.
So we're looking for an answer that mentions 3 owners, Brenda, Sharika, and Adam's heirs. Well, A only mentions how many owners?
2.
2.
So here's my question about A. Where's Adam?
Yeah. Where's the third share?
Right, where's the
6
third
feet
share?
under.
Right? And then C, Brenda, Sharika, and Adam's heirs are all tenants in common. Why would Brenda and Sharika change? Nothing changed about them, right?
Yes.
No.
No.
Nothing changed.
Nothing changed for them. So they stay joint tenants. And then C, Adam's heirs will participate in the right of survivorship. They can't participate in the right of survivorship because Adam couldn't participate in the right of survivorship because he wasn't there from the what?
Beginning.
So that leaves us with B. Brenda and Sharika own the property as joint tenants with each other and share ownership with Adam's heirs as tenant in common. So 3 owners, 2 of them are joint, 1 is tenant in common.
Yep. Very good job. I like that we just went through this because I thought that A would have been correct, but we're still missing that third share. I didn't think that it was correct, but I thought that it was,
partially correct.
It is partially correct. I mean, but you're missing the share.
It's 1/3 correct. 2/3 correct.
Right.
Exactly. All right, so let's look at another one then. It says Mary owns her home in Charlotte in Severalty before marrying Jock. After they're married, they purchase an additional home on Lake Norman. Which of the following statements is not, so remember you're playing true, false with all 4. Which of the following statements is not accurate regarding the ownership of Mary and Jock? So go ahead and take a look at that and see which one you come up with.
So remember to do that test taking strategy, label them true and false, and choose the different answer.
The different answer. That's right.
And don't try to be like me and try to not do it, because it will harm you every time.
I'm telling you, that strategy makes a big difference.
Right.
Don't try to say, am I looking for the true one or am I looking for the false one? Stop being
Oh.
Some of you are being stubborn right now, and you sit there and you get, and we're literally telling you how to answer, and you won't do it. Answer them all, true or false, and choose the one that is what?
Different.
Different. I promise it will work every time there's a negative question.
The ugly duckling answer.
Mm-hmm. Remember, you're looking for the different one, the not right.
The different one. It's the one that doesn't match, the one that stands out. I don't care if that's true. I don't care if it's false. If it's different, that's what I'm looking for. Don't sit there and say, I'm looking for the false one. Don't sit there and say, I'm looking for the true one. You're looking for the different one.
I am guilty.
So that means you got to answer 4 questions. You got to sit there and say true or false 4 times. So look at A. Mary and Jock could not continue to own the Lake Norman property as tenants by the entirety if they were to divorce. True or false?
True.
False.
False.
Mary.
True.
True.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That one's true.
I'm sorry.
See, that's the problem.
I
You're
need a
trying
coffee.
to answer the stupid test questions. Stop. Take that statement by itself. I cannot stress enough, these test-taking strategies only work if you use them. Is it a true statement that if they get divorced, they cannot be tenants by the entirety?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
true.
Not accurate. I'm silly.
It's true.
Stop worrying about the test question will take care of itself if you will focus on these 4 statements. They can't be tenants by the entirety if they get a divorce. Period. True. B. Doc would need to sign away any potential marital interest in the Charlotte home before Mary could sell it.
True.
True.
It's true.
True. C. Jock and Mary own both properties as tenants by the entirety.
False.
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 Because they wasn't married when the
One, they
was
bought before they were married, right?
Yep.
Correct.
And then D, the home on Lake Norman is held as tenants by the entirety. What?
True.
True.
Look at that. True, true, false, true. I wonder what the answer is.
The false. Different.
Yeah.
That strategy will work when you have those negative questions. But if
Every time.
If you're sitting there chasing it going, oh, wait, they're looking for the night. Stop. Don't do that to yourself. Don't do that to yourself.
Like negative questions.
I lost you, Christine. It was very good.
Yes.
I don't know what that was. I'm sorry.
I said, I don't like those negative questions. I always get so
That's why you do this.
If you will employ this strategy, you'll love the negative questions. They actually become the easiest questions to answer because it becomes so clear. Here's the ones that are the nightmare. Which of the following is most correct? That's when you got to rank them. Those are way worse questions. The negative questions, it's going to be 3 clear one way and 1 clearly the other way. And you always choose the one that goes the opposite way.
I've noticed on those, and I don't think we've had those yet, the most likely to be true. I've noticed that the one that is like number 2 is worded a little bit more clearly towards the rule. And then the one that's actually correct, like uses different terms, but it's like way more
that's just
precise.
Right. Yeah.
So they make you second guess.
Those are the 3 different types of concurrent ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And that leaves us with only what we call hybrid or fancy ownership. Fancy ownership is joint tenancy, tenancy in common, and tenancy by the entirety don't work. This is a property where we're sharing ownership, but for some reason, none of those 3 options works. Like, look at this building right here, a condominium. What do you think?
Exactly how, I'm sorry, Tamina's question, exactly how they are written in these slideshows.
Right. What are some of the negative words? Not, except, untrue, any negative word.
Yes.
Look at this building. What would be the problem if all these people bought this building as tenants in common? If you had 50 owners that bought this building as tenants in common, what would be the inherent problem that you would see?
How would you divide it up?
How would
shares?
You can't. If they're tenants in common, how much do they get to use?
0.222.
No, if they're tenants in common, how much?
Oh.
All
of it.
All of it.
100% of it.
Could they all be in each other's bedrooms at any time legally if they were all tenants?
True.
Yeah.
Isn't that going to be a problem?
That would get your ass out.
Same thing would be with joint tenancy, and they definitely can't be tenants by the entirety because there's 50 of them, right? The problem here is we don't want them to share access all the time to all of these units. Even though they're going to own this whole piece of land and this building together, don't we need some boundaries here?
Yes.
Yep.
Condominiums allow us to set up those boundaries, because here's what's going to happen. What we're going to do is we're going to draw a very vivid dividing line right here. Right here. And everything down here, the land, is going to be owned collectively as tenants in common by all of those people. But we're also going to divide these individual units into airspace. And each unit has separate airspace. And so when you purchase a condominium unit, what you're actually purchasing is two separate things. You are purchasing your airspace in your unit in severalty, not shared. The airspace is not shared. The airspace is individually owned. In other words, if I own unit 12, can I keep everybody else out of the airspace inside unit 12?
Yes.
Yes, because I own that airspace. But can I keep everybody else out of the hallways and the swimming pool and the land and the rest of the building?
No.
No, because we all own those things together as what?
Tenants in common.
Tenants in common. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
So the land, the structure, the buildings, the improvements is all owned commonly, because it's shared. But the airspace within the units, we call it paint to paint, is owned individually. So when you buy a condo unit, technically, what are you buying?
The air.
The air inside of that unit.
Versus the land.
Versus the land, and not just the land, the building, the walls. Who owns the toilet? Even though it's inside your airspace, who owns the toilet?
The building.
Everybody does as a tenant in common. So whose permission do you need to make improvements?
Because land is everything plus land plus everything attached to it.
So who do you have to talk to make improvements inside your airspace?
Everybody in the condominium.
Everybody else, because you all own it together. You all own that structure together. You can't knock that wall down.
That's crazy. So if I wanted to change my toilet, I'd have to contact everybody else.
Better get a group text.
Because you might be messing with the air under you.
And since that would be so cumbersome, that's actually the root of where everybody's favorite 3-letter abbreviation comes from. Folks, where do you think HOAs were first born? In condominiums. Because is it going to be hard to talk to every single one of your neighbors and get permission to change your toilet?
Yes.
So doesn't it make more sense for them to get together and form a group that makes those kinds of decisions on behalf of everybody?
Yes.
So what's the real answer? When you want to change the toilet, who do you most likely need to go talk to?
HOA.
The HOA, because the HOA has been created to make those kinds of decisions on behalf of all of the homeowners as a group. Flo, you had a question?
Yes. So when we say airspace in this scenario, we're talking about literal airspace, not airspace as in what we talked about the other day when we talk about the ability to build up, right?
Yeah. So reach up and touch the ceiling. You've gone too far. Reach down and touch the floor. You've gone too far. Everything between those two, that's the airspace we're talking about.
Gotcha. All
paint,
right.
Paint to paint within that unit. That's what's owned individually. That's what you can keep others out of. Now, in North Carolina, condominiums are subject to a specific law. That's why I put the North Carolina flag. This is the only thing we talk about in this chapter that is very specific to North Carolina. I've given you the little warning here. In North Carolina, if you're buying a condo that's new, only if it's new, I'm going to repeat that, only if it's new, only if it's new, only if it's new, only if it's new. Does this apply to resale condos?
No.
No.
Only if it's new. A buyer who signs a purchase contract. Now, we're not talking about after a deed because a deed is final. There's no takesies, backsies once a deed's been recorded. But if a buyer signs a purchase contract, even if they pay a quote unquote non-refundable deposit, if that is a new construction condo, the state of North Carolina says you get 7 days to think about it and change your mind. And if you change your mind during that 7 days, you get what?
Your money back.
You get your money back. Any deposits you paid, you get out of the contract, you get any deposits back, but only if it's what kind of condo?
New.
It's new. Not newer, only if it's what?
Brand new.
Never been occupied. So how many times is this law going to apply to each condo unit in the state?
Once.
One time.
Once. The first time it's sold. That's it. If you're buying a resale condo, you don't get any time to second think about it. Works just like any other sale. On the test and not in real life, you might see some mention of a cooperative. Here's what you do. Make a flashcard for yourself. Stock, co-op, stock, co-op. That's it. And you don't need to know anything deeper than that because you're never going to deal with one. They don't exist in North Carolina. A cooperative is a form of shared ownership where you purchase stock in order to get access to the property. Rather than purchasing like a condo, the airspace of the unit itself, you are purchasing stock in a company that owns the building. We do not have these in North Carolina. It could show up as an answer choice on a test question in the national section. So you just need to know that the only type of real estate purchase that refers to stock would be a cooperative. Okay. Townhomes really don't need much of a special description in North Carolina because they are just like single family homes. There is no difference between a townhome. They should not be compared to condos. They are nothing like condos because when you purchase a townhome in North Carolina, you are not just purchasing airspace. You are purchasing the building. You are purchasing the structure. You are purchasing the land underneath that structure. So I have people all the time, they'll say, because you might not be able to look from the outside and tell whether that's a condo or a townhouse, but you can look at the land records, the tax records, and tell. What's the acreage going to read for a condo?
Like zero.
Not like zero. What's the acreage going to read for a condo?
Zero. Zero.
Because you're purchasing what?
The airspace.
Airspace.
Structure. The land.
Is there going to be acreage for a townhouse?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Because you're purchasing what?
Yes.
Land.
The land. It might not be much acreage. It might be 0.03 acres. But it will have some land. Condos have no land because the land is part of the building that's being bought in a different group as a big group. With townhomes, these are individual structures. They just happen to share what between them?
Wall.
A wall. Wall or two, depending on if it's an in unit or a middle unit. That's it. Okay. And the very last thing that we mention in this chapter, in this section, is our friend, the timeshare. Timeshares, folks, are condos on steroids. That's all these are. Here's the thing. I'm gonna back up to the condo screen for a second. When we divided this airspace out, didn't we make it so that this building could have like 50 owners?
Yes.
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 Right. But each owner has the right to their airspace 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Does that make sense for everybody in a condo?
Yes.
You don't have the right to everybody else's unit, but you do have the right to your unit all the time. Is everybody okay with that in a condo?
Yes.
So take the restrictions of a condo and now go further. Take the restrictions of this condo where you divide each one of these into an airspace unit. And so let's say there might be 400 units total in this development now. But you also divide up the time. So you got 400 units, and let's say each owner can only use their unit for 1 week per year. It could be 1 month, it could be 1 weekend, but let's just say weekly. If each unit can only be used by its owner for 1 week per year, how many different owners can that one unit have?
52.
Many.
52, because there are 52 weeks in the year, right?
Yes.
Right.
So that means 400 units times 52 owners per unit, folks. If you do the math, how many owners can we now have of this one property?
Too many.
20,000 different owners for that one property now. Simply because, and that's not like a number you need to memorize because I just made up the 400 units, simply because each unit now has so many owners. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yep.
So a timeshare happens anytime you are dividing up not only the airspace, but also the time. All a timeshare is the guaranteed use of real estate for a certain limited time each year. That's all it is. In North Carolina, we have the rule of 5 for timeshares. This is a slide I would suggest you go back and look over in your studies this weekend because it's a North Carolina specific law that you might see as a test question on the state specific section. In North Carolina, our definition of a timeshare is the guaranteed right to use a property at least 5 separate times. So I have this week this year and the next another week the next year, but I'm in and out how many separate times? At least how many separate times?
5.
5. And I could be in and out forever, but at least 5 times. And it has to be over a duration of at least a 5-year time period. I don't have to occupy the property for 5 years, but I have to be going in and out for at least how long?
5 years.
5 years. In other words, if I reserve the same house that I rent at Atlantic Beach every week, Memorial Week for the next 10 years, do I have a lease or do I now have a timeshare?
Timeshare.
Timeshare.
I have a timeshare because I have 1 week per year every year for the next what?
5 years.
10.
5 years.
10, which is more than 5. You know, and here's what the state of North Carolina says about that. That's timeshare. And if it's a timeshare in North Carolina, you get 5 days to change your mind after any timeshare contract you sign. You get 5 days to think about it. If you go to that high pressure presentation in the state of North Carolina and you sign an agreement to purchase a timeshare and you walk out of there thinking, oh my God, what did I just do? You can change your mind and get all your money back as long as you do it within the first what?
5 days.
5 days.
That is a North Carolina specific law. It only applies to timeshares that are signed in the state of North Carolina. And that is 5 calendar days. Christina asked, do you have to be a broker to sell timeshares in North Carolina? Yes, you absolutely do. North Carolina is one of the states that heavily regulates timeshares, and you have to have a real estate license in order to sell. That's why the North Carolina Real Estate Commission has the ability to charge money to people who violate the Timeshare Act in North Carolina. And the North Carolina Real Estate Commission can fine timeshare developers the developers up to $500 per violation. So Christina asked, do you have to be a broker to sell timeshares? And I said, yes. So what if we put an unlicensed person in that office and 100 different people come in that office that day? How many violations is that?
100.
100
different violations. At how much per violation?
$500.
That's a $50,000 fine for that one day for that developer.
Wow.
So change your mind. You've got 7 days with a condo and 5 days with the timeshare.
But only new construction.
New construction.
New construction.
Right.
Okay.
And the way that I look at that, the fine, because the North Carolina Real Estate Commission can never find a broker. They can only find developers of timeshares. Yeah. So I think of them as being like, don't practice real estate if you're not licensed.
That's it. That's exactly what they tell you, because you got to be licensed. Yeah. And that, folks, is the end of Unit 2.2. Look at that.
Wow.
It's a lot. It is such a lot.
Yes.
But I think we